All right, good morning. I'm glad to be here. Uh, I do apologize up front that the glare of my head is going to be quite bright. All right, so what we're going to do, sort of a layout for us. I agree for Terry and the church having me up here to record is paramount. It also allows any of you to go back and watch whatever. I have submitted PowerPoints. I'm sure he's going to hate me for this. If you want the PowerPoints, contact the church and we can get those to you because Terry is like myself. We learn a lot by pictures. And so in the PowerPoint coming up, there's some pictures and things that will help us. But for the first session this morning, it's actually the one thing I don't enjoy doing, which is just kind of giving just information about the book. I mean, I think that's important, but I would rather spend the rest of our time in the Bible itself. So this first hour, we're really kind of going to go quickly through this sheet of paper. We will look at some of the text mentioned here. It's just on the PowerPoint as well. I want this to be just like a classroom. I know for recording purposes that may not be ideal for viewership, but at any point you have a question, just raise your hand, and if I don't see you, just interrupt. All right? And if you do ask the question, ask it loud enough that I can hear it. I will repeat it so that those who are watching the recording can hear it, and that's how we'll kind of move forward. Along the way, sort of things to point out, as once we get into the text, I will at points show you we'll read a text and I'll say, here are the interpretive options, because at some points it's unclear. And so then I'll give you the options of interpretation and how those impact the book itself. And then probably Friday morning, that session is probably going to be very difficult for all of us. It's Exodus 32. It is my favorite chapter of the entire Old Testament to teach on. And I still don't know what I believe about Exodus 32. I know it sounds strange. I've been teaching for 16 years full time. Last semester, I just finished teaching a PhD seminar in the book of Exodus, where they translated roughly 50 to 60% of the book, and they read thousands of pages, and so did I. And I still don't know what I believe about Exodus 32. But I know that I will confuse you equally when we get to Exodus 32. All right, so let's jump in. Zach's got the PowerPoints queued up for us. And at times I'm going to have to look over because my eyesight is slowly getting bad. But before the first slide, on Roman numeral 1, and those watching later can ask Carrie for these printouts, just an overview of the book itself. Now, the book of Exodus, it says, quote, contains the storyline after the death of Joseph. We see the death of Joseph in Genesis chapter 50, verse 22 through 26. And then we know that the book of Exodus begins roughly 400 years later. And we know that because it introduces Joseph. Notice again in chapter 1, if you have your Bible, you're going to have to multitask, Bible one hand, pen in another. But you'll notice in chapter 1 of Exodus, it says, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All the offspring of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was also in Egypt. Then it tells us, then Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all of that generation. But the descendants of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, which is sort of an echo from Genesis chapter 1. You are to be fruitful and multiply. Now, the reason, this is not on your notes, the reason that Joseph and those first few verses about Jacob's children are in this first chapter is because if we have a Torah scroll, if you've ever seen a picture of a Torah scroll that's in a synagogue, if it's the first 5 books, if you were to unroll that Torah scroll, it's 33 meters wide. It's impossible to carry. That's why they're on rolling carts. So you can imagine as they're wandering for a long period of time, carrying those things becomes difficult. The first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are all equally about the same size. And so the theory, key word there is theory. What do we know about a theory? We don't know the answer. The theory. The theory is that each individual book was on its own scroll for handling purposes. As a result, Moses would have included chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, so that you, the reader or hearer, would know that this is the second book after Genesis. Does everybody understand? It's very important. And by the way, it's found that way in every book: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. Ruth is at the back of the Hebrew Bible. Each conclusion and each introduction of the first 8 books are like this, which tells us they had to have been individual books so that the hearers and listeners would know, when I read this one, this is coming after the previous one that's mentioned. Now, what's also important here, I don't elaborate, but I do think it's helpful. This is where we're never going to get done, is Genesis 15. We have to go to Genesis 15 real quickly. I know this is an Exodus Bible study, but I also know that Exodus is interacting with a lot of material from Genesis, and it behooves me to go back. So Genesis 15, I think Terry preached through Genesis. Did you not, Reese? Like within the last couple of years? No? Yes, okay. So chapter 15 is where the word covenant is used. So in chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, you have God promising all these things to Abram and giving him the imperative go. In chapter 15 is where God commands him to take those animals and cut them in half, right? You remember that? And the animals are placed half on each side, and then that covenant ceremony is if it were 2 people doing it. If Terry and I were doing it, we would walk through those cut animals and we would make an oath between my God and his God. And if I broke that oath, that his God and he could cut me in half and kill my whole family. Real pleasant. But in the midst of this, after he then cuts them in half, that's in verses 7 and following, we have this beginning in verse 12. It says, this, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a dread of great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certainty that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there, and they will be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment upon that nation which they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you will be buried with your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So typically when we're reading this chapter, we sort of overlook those verses, because the very next section, verse 17 and following, which we're going to come back to in the second session today, is where the burning bush in chapter 3 actually is pulling from Genesis 15. So what we see is that God tells Abram that your descendants are going to find themselves in Egypt. That's the whole Joseph narrative, which, by the way, parallels Abram going into Egypt in chapter 12 of Genesis. And then we get in chapter 1 of Exodus, then we see that connection. So in chapter 15, it's I don't even want to call it a prophecy, because God's just telling him this is going to happen. Like that's not a prophecy. It's a truth that will happen. I am going to enslave your descendants for the purpose of the rest of this week of teaching God's deliverance out of Egypt. So that moves us to the letter B on our handout. The primary theme of the book is that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God, right, is now the God of the nation Israel. Throughout the entire Old Testament, we see that, particularly in Genesis, God reveals himself to Adam and Eve. He reveals himself to Noah, to Abram, Jacob, Joseph, Isaac, and then he's going to reveal himself to Moses. And the difference is, when he reveals himself to Moses, he says what? I want you to go back and declare who I am to my people. And so now we go from God isolating relationships with individuals to now taking a specific individual, and he is to share who God is to his people. And we're going to come back to this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob thing. And then if I quote something, I always put the author and the page numbers. That doesn't mean you should go buy those books. Sometimes you shouldn't, but sometimes they say something really helpful. Here it says, the book of Exodus provides, quote, a literary link between the history of the patriarchs and the history of the people of Israel, which will be chronicled through most of the Old Testament. I've already mentioned then the story begins with God supernaturally rescuing the enslaved Israelites from Egyptian bondage with the aid of Moses. And then I tell you in bold, letter D, the miraculous rescuing of Israel, the Israelites became known as the greatest salvific event of the Old Testament. Now, what that means is, I know when we talk church language, salvation is that you repent of your sins and believe that Jesus Christ died for your sins and that He resurrected and will return. That is not what this means. This means God saved them. He delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. We will see as we work through the text, God loves a very specific metaphor. Many of you have had children in your life. You recall when they were quite young. And when you would get out of the car, you would simply take your hand, and if your kid was obedient, like two of my children were, I have three, they would simply grab your hand and you would walk them across the parking lot into the store. How does God describe His bringing Israel out of Egypt? I took you by the hand and I brought you out of the land of bondage into the land of promise. That's what that theme means. Once on the run from their Egyptian oppressors, the Israelites encountered God at Mount Sinai. We'll do a lot of that tomorrow. And then He commands them to build an earthly tabernacle, which we'll also talk about on Friday. All right, that moves us into the book overviews. Now we're going to go quickly. You can read. I don't need to read it all to you. But I will tell you the English title comes directly from the main theme, which is God delivering Israel out of Egypt. That's where we get the word Exodus. I did sort of scrub my notes to make it less offensive so I could be a more offensive up here. The Hebrew title, like most Old Testament books, the Hebrew title comes from the first words of the Hebrew text. So chapter 1 of Exodus, and these are the names. Also not a good title for the book of Exodus. But I would argue that the English, as it comes through the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that's the LXX, the Septuagint, means departure. And that's also a terrible name for the book. Because they only depart in chapters 13 through 19, right? Everything before 13 is all of the life about Moses, and then the plagues in chapter 7 through chapter 12 to 13, and then they go through the Red Sea in 14. Moses starts singing a really difficult, cool song in chapter 15, and then they're on the run in chapter 16, and they come to Sinai at 19. And so they're at Sinai in chapter 19, all the way through the end of the book in chapter 40. They're at Sinai the entire book of Leviticus. And they're at Sinai in Numbers chapter 1 all the way to chapter 10, verse 11. And that's 1 year. So the title Exodus also is not a really great title. But that's what we get to work with. And if you don't like that, I'm sorry. All right, the date. All right, so dating biblical texts is not ever easy. Particularly in the Old Testament, but I'll do my best. The internal date, right? The internal date, meaning things in the text itself, helps us to determine a date. We obviously know that Moses is the main character, and we can safely believe that he was the main author, if not the sole author. Because it says, and God said to Moses, and Moses wrote these things. Now, we'll talk about chapters 20 through 23 because it says God wrote those. I think he did, and I think Moses probably then had to put them in there. But Moses is the author, and so historically, he's been viewed as the traditional author. Now, I'm not going to chase this rabbit, but needless to say, there are a lot of scholars who deny Moses wrote these works. Terry and I both believe he wrote this work. That should be sufficient. The book contains also, I think that's sufficient. If you say it with enough authority, they'll believe you. That's right. All right. The book contains historical markers that can be placed in the 15th century. So that is the 1400s BC. Okay? So we'll talk about those. But more importantly, if you want to turn quickly to 1 Kings chapter 6. So one of the beauties that I get to do with my academic career is you have to learn the chronology of the Old Testament. And really you can't date with specificity the book of Genesis or parts of Exodus or Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy without the book of Samuel and Kings, because we know without a shadow of a doubt when David lived and when Solomon lived. Does everybody understand? And so you take those as your true historical markers, and then you have to reconstruct dating backwards. It's not ideal. It's kind of the world I have to deal with. But chapter 1 or chapter 6 of 1 Kings is very important to us. It says in verse 1, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So this is talking about building the temple. And so we have here on the notes, it simply says that the Exodus happened 480 years prior. So we know that Solomon's reign was either 970 or 960. That's not disputed by anybody. You're like, well, those are two different dates. Well, that accounts Saul and his reign. That's not really an issue. And then I don't do math. I'm from Winfield. Math was not really a strong suit in Wynn Parish. That's funny. I don't care who you are. That's funny. I don't care who you are. As long as you can play football, that's all that matters. You know what I mean? Roll Tide. That's when I make fun of people, I say Roll Tide, by the way. That's me making fun of Alabama people. If I subtract 4 from 960, that gives me 956. And my calculator tells me when I add 480, I get 1446. Or down to around 1436. Does everybody understand? So the internal date of the book of Exodus through 1 Kings 6 is around 1446 to 1436. All right, there's some additional information. I'm not concerned about that. You can read that because that's more speculative as it relates to the book of Judges. But we certainly have a date for the Exodus based on 1 Kings chapter 6. All right, let's move to Roman numeral 4. Do I have any questions about the date, by the way? All right, Terry. Sure. Correct. Yeah, so Terry's question was, or comment was, okay, archaeology, the internet, as people talk about said archaeology, has sort of muddied the waters, okay? So I'll handle that real quickly, okay? I think real quickly. We'll do our best. All right, so really there's 2 dates for the book of Exodus. There is the 15th century date, the one is posited here, 1446, and the second one is 1260 BC, which is called the 13th century date, or sometimes called the early date, that's the 1446, or the late date, the 1260. Now, the 1260 takes most of the information as symbolic. They take 480, for example, is 12 times 40. My calculator tells me that's 480. How many years did Saul reign as king? 40. How many years did David reign as king? 40. How many years did Solomon reign as king? 40. The number 40 in the wilderness, there's 40 years. There's 40 days of Jesus fasting. And so the argument is the number 40 becomes symbolic rather than a literal. Does everybody understand? As different as you probably do not agree to that, that's actually an evangelical position. Okay, I'm protecting you because you're the church. I teach students for the church, but they have to be aware of what Terry just mentioned. Here's the real truth. If you even believe an Exodus happened, period, irregardless of the date, you're a conservative. Like, I know that sounds crazy, but within the world of scholarship, within the world of even denominational Christianity, there are churches that will deny the historicity of an Exodus event. So the fact that we're even saying it happened means we're all conservative. Now, I have my position on one of these 2 dates. You will see it in a minute. After the break, it'll become very clear to you. but I will do very much my best to show you both arguments. Now, Terry's question about archaeology, and I'll try not to chase the rabbit too much, but it is worth noting. So in the book of Joshua, everything with Exodus depends on Joshua. Okay? They come out of the land of Egypt. They then wander for 40 years. You're not going to find archaeological evidence of them wandering for 40 years because they're wandering for 40 years. I mean, you're not going to find their houses. You know what I mean? You're not going to find their sandals because they never wore out. Hey, there you go. The book of Joshua, however, they enter the promised land in chapter 6. And they destroy Jericho. And then they start conquering other cities. There are 40 cities that they are conquering in the book of Joshua. Of those 40 cities, only 3 have been discovered to have evidence of destruction via archaeology. Okay. The absence of evidence is not the proof of evidence. However, the scholars know this, but they use it to their advantage. So any scholar will say the absence of any evidence does not prove anything until they want to use these aspects for archaeology to disprove the historicity of the Israelites. But really, what are they trying to disprove? The miracles of God. There's a driving force behind it. Now, Jericho is the prickly point. Jericho has 32 layers of destruction, which means Jericho was destroyed 32 times. Apparently they were, I don't know, halting. I don't understand. They just could not win a game. Is that too harsh? I'm trying. Throw shots at everybody. So what ends up happening is you are then dating layers of destruction. And one layer does date to the 13th century or the 12th century. It's a little vague. There is no destruction layer at the 15th century level. Again, that does not disprove the 1446 date, because you subtract 40, 1400 for the book of Joshua. So really archaeology, unfortunately, Terry and I were trained 25 years ago at LC, that archaeology helps support and defend the Bible, because people like William Foxwell Albright and others were Christians doing archaeology, and now archaeology has moved into a purely scientific model where you are to disengage confessional belief systems from it. And so it's not used to prove anything. They're only trying to prove data. Now, I will share this one small anecdote. I won't use his name because it's being recorded. Years ago, I bought a oil lamp in Old City of Jerusalem. I was in the Old City. I went into an Aramean Christian man's shop. And he had a bunch of them there. And he's like, I got a bunch of first century oil lamps. And I was like, I would love to have one. Obviously, it wasn't Jesus's, but I wanted something that his time. That was $100. I thought it was a great deal. Got a good deal on it. So it was in my office. And our archaeology professor came in the office one day to see me, and he turned around and he sees this oil lamp, and he says, "What's that?" I'm like, "You're the archaeologist. You tell me." Like I didn't say that to him. I said, "It's an oil lamp I bought in Jerusalem in the Old City for $100. It's a first century oil lamp." He said, "Do you mind? Can I touch it?" I was like, "Feel free. You're the archaeologist, man. You studied under the world's most famous archaeologist who's alive today. Yeah, I want you to look at it." He picks it up. He looks at it. He looks at me, and I quote, "Do you mind if I lick it?" Whatever floats your boat, man. Whatever. It's a little weird to me. He licks it, and he says, "It's a fake." So as soon as he walked out, he explained why it was a fake, because it looked real. He said it's got this certain texture to it that's been applied by sandblasting. It's not authentic. He walks out of my office. I walk over there and grab it, and I throw it in the trash can. I may have thrown away a 2,000-year-old oil lamp based off one man's tongue. I tell that story as a joke, but the reality is archaeology is a science, but it also involves interpretation of data. And in this scenario, the interpretation was his tongue. I'm not discrediting archaeology. I'm simply saying when your definition of any scientific endeavor is it is a science and an art and an interpretation, those two last points aren't always as factual as one would want it to be. To say it differently, the glass is either half full or half empty. And if I'm a person who is not a religious person, the glass will always be half empty. And so I will always view the data through the lens of suspicion and questions of historicity and authenticity. So I think that I chase that rabbit. But that should not bother you that there's not archaeological evidence of these destruction layers. You go to Hatzor, where they destroy in the book of Joshua, and it says they burned it. Guess what the Hatzor actually has? Burn ash layers dating around the 12th, 13th century, or 13th or 12th century, which aligns with one of those theories. Again, it may be older, but you're trying to date things that happened literally 3,500 years ago. How do you determine within a century or two layers of ash? But what it does prove is that city was burned to a crisp, which is what the Bible says. It also does not take into account that as Israel comes into the land, that they may not have destroyed it the way we think of destruction. They could have defeated it, and then half the people said, you know what, I would rather not die. How about that? How about you have the city? And I know that the book of Joshua says they destroyed them all, but have you read the next book, the book of Judges, where they're still in the land causing a good bit of problem? And so what we find is that's not a contradiction. It just shows that they were not willing to kill everyone, and that it turned into a problem in the book of Judges. I hope I answered your question. But I do believe in a true historical exodus. I think to quote actually the guy that's in the notes, Nahum Sarna, he's a dead Jewish scholar, and he said it best in his book. He said, "How or why would Israel in their sacred scriptures keep referring back to an event if it weren't real? Like, why would you ever, all these different texts from different centuries, why do they all go back to when God delivered us?" It's the same way it goes for modern Jews today. If he were still alive, Nahum would say the same thing, is that God, the modern day Jews say that God would deliver them once again the way they delivered them from the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Nazis. Like, that's their mindset because it is tethered to this book. If it is a fictitious event, then for 3,500 years, an entire nation, people group have been deceiving themselves about God's miraculous power. Moving on. I hope that helped. All right. That's why I don't like archaeology. I do, but don't all at the same time. Roman number 4, we have historical background. We're going to hit on this a lot, so repeat of other stuff. The Exodus event, when I say Exodus event, that means them coming out of Egypt. So anytime Exodus is lowercase, I'm referring to them leaving the land of Egypt. If it is capitalized, I'm talking about the book. The Exodus event delivers the Israelites from the imperialistic ideals of the Egyptian pharaohs. Now, I'm going to unpack that after break with pictures so we all can learn. We will read about Israel's forced slavery. I'll give you some insight into what that looked like. And then I think it's worth noting that slavery in the ancient Near East, that's not just Israel, all of the ancient Near East, is drastically different than the things we have seen in America or in the modern understanding of slavery. I've already told you about the greatest salvific event, so you don't forget that. And then letter C is God establishes a covenant with the Israelites while humiliating the Egyptians. And that has got to be key when we get to those sections. All right. From there, by the way, that's a picture of them making bricks. That's from Egypt in one of their friezes showing various people making bricks. And then the humiliation of the Egyptians is linked to the theme of death. This comes from Joseph Blenkinsopp's book called The Pentateuch, which is really in this section, really helpful elsewhere, not so much. Here it says, the story of Israel's oppression and a divine deliverance is controlled by the theme of the endangered firstborn. We're going to spend a good bit of time in a minute on Shiphrah and Puah in chapter 1, verse 15 through 22, those two midwives, where the Pharaoh says, kill all the firstborn baby boys. Well, what happens after the Passover? God sends the destroyer and kills all the firstborn boys. We then see, he says, cast them into the Nile because they won't do it. Right? How does God choose to kill the rest of the Egyptians that chase after the Israelites? In the Red Sea. They're paralleling one another. That does not disprove the historicity of both. It shows that the Pharaoh had imperialistic ideals of oppression, and God reveals through the plagues that I am God, not you, a demigod, or your little gods of your pantheon, and I will do the very things you thought you were going to do to my children, I will do to you and your children. And that's it is a beautiful thing, but people died in the moment of it. And so then we understand that as we work through that. And then God's revealing himself to Moses set in motion his redemptive acts on behalf of the Israelites, and that's Exodus chapter 3. Real quickly, you can see how the literary structure of the book works. I could go through like a detailed literary structure. In many ways, you can see it two different ways. Geographically, that means how they are geographically in Egypt, and then it's in the wilderness, and then at Sinai. Or you can do a 3-point sermon over the entire book. It's relief. God saves Israel from Egyptian bondage. There's a relationship that God establishes through his law, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And then there is religion, and I don't mean religion in a negative sense. I mean God teaches Israel how to worship him. I was being a Baptist. I had to have 3 R's. And alliteration had to work. Okay? Moving on. Characteristics of the book. We see letter A, Exodus institutes a relationship between law and narrative. We're going to see this in the 10 Commandments, where the first verse of chapter 20, it says, because the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. He then gives the laws. Think about it as a parent. As a parent, sometimes my children would say, I'll say, you need to do this. Well, why do I need to do that? And I say, because I'm your parent, but not just your parent. It's because I love you, and here are examples of how I love you and things I've done for you. And those very things substantiate why I ask you to do this. So when you get to the law portions, it's taking for granted everything God has done up to that point as validation of why you should listen and worship him through these strange laws at times. And then from there, it says the law portions are independent compositions. Now, all that means is that in Exodus specifically, God wrote those. It's pretty clever. We're going to read it pretty closely in Exodus 34. It says, Moses, go get 2 tablets. Bring them over here to me. I'm going to write on them, front and back. Which means there's writing on both one side and the other. The text literally says that. And then he says to Moses, go get those stones because the first ones that I wrote, you broke. So we then see they're called the Book of the Covenant in chapter 24, which means God wrote those. So that means that these words are God's specific words. Moses then fashions them into the narrative and fits them perfectly. And that's all that means, is that they're an independent composition or compositions, because the 10 Commandments, they believe, is separate from the Book of the Covenant. So they differentiate those. Genesis provided multiple portraits of God's power and his sovereignty in selecting the younger ones over the older, which is then the context of promise and covenant, which is also, we're going to see coming through as God calls Israel his sons, his children. And then the book of Exodus portrays the power of God in his redemption to his chosen nation, which we'll talk a bit about. And then there is a connection between creation and the Exodus, the two themes of the biblical religion of those things. Creation asserts God's undivided sovereignty over nature, and the Exodus reveals God's absolute hegemonic power. Like he's over it all. And this is where I don't have time to cover it in here, but Genesis 1 has embedded in it polemical language. Does anyone know what that means? Like it's an apologetics. Does everybody know what apologetics is? Like defending the faith. A polemic is a verbal or written attack against something else. So Genesis 1, very much historically true, literal 24-hour day creation, but embedded in what he says is attacking the other ancient Near Eastern religions. Because remember, Moses is also believed to have been the author of Genesis, and the audience of Genesis, it's going to hurt your head, right? The audience of Genesis is actually the Israelites in Egypt. If Moses is the author, he's recording old things that happened for this group of people in the book we're studying this week. And they're bombarded with all these pagan deities that are everywhere, and embedded in that Genesis 1 account are comments that we're actually going to see in a little bit, connecting them to the plague cycles. And to put it differently, the God of the Israelites is the true creator, universal God, and not all the gods of Egypt. And then there's even embedded things of are the gods in Canaan that you don't even know yet, that you will encounter. So we'll get there as well. And so then obviously I give you 4 theological or didactic teaching purposes. God is sovereign over nature. We see that. Humanity cannot defy God, and history has meaning and purpose. And fourthly, God is the redeemer for injustice and oppression, which is chapter 3, 4, and 5. All right, do I have questions? Perfect. No questions. Let's grab our Bibles. Zach, if you want to change over to the next PowerPoint, we're just going to be probably in the first 2 chapters. You said 10 o'clock, 10:05? 10:15, perfect. All right, so we're going to dive right in. All right, I've already read the first 7 verses for us, so we don't have to go over chapter 4 or chapter 1, verse 1 through 7. We're going to pick up at verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know that of Joseph. And behold, he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel have become too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befalls us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Now, it is interesting that archaeologists have discovered ancient texts elsewhere that also mention that Egypt loved to collect slaves. And so they'll deny the Exodus event, but they will say Egypt is known to collect foreigners from different places as slaves. So we do know that they prove themselves, our argument for us. It is worth noting the reason he mentions king. Okay, so several years ago, my entire family, my in-laws were with us. We stopped off on our way back from Africa in London for 4 days, and we went to Buckingham Palace. And we went and watched the changing of the guard, and you know, Gideon was like 11, so he's getting older where he can understand. And he says, "Who lives here?" I was like, "Well, unfortunately, it's King Charles. We wish it was Queen Elizabeth, but she died. But King Charles." He goes, "Oh, so the king, he's like the president." I was like, "No, that's the prime minister. We passed his house earlier, right?" So I'm having to help my 11-year-old understand the difference between president, king, and prime minister. Does everybody understand? Now, why would I even tell you this weird story? Because Israel doesn't understand Pharaoh. They understand king. They understand they will have a king later, and all the countries they encounter have kings, but ironically, the strange one is in Egypt, they have pharaohs. But as we work through chapter 1, he starts alternating both, which we'll deal with in due course. And so he said to his people, "Behold, the people have become too many." So this is talking about the fulfillment of then Genesis 1, 26 and 27, "Be fruitful and multiply." They have continued to grow. Verse 11, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramesses." Now, Ramesses is a city which was in antiquity, and so there are multiple Ramesses. There's Ramesses the first. There's Ramesses the second, which lines up with the 13th century Exodus, and he is known as the great builder of the Egyptian dynasty of like building things. But that doesn't mean that Ramesses the city wasn't built before that in the 15th century. Does everybody understand? So people who advocate for the 13th century, they say, see, it's Ramesses the second. And I'm like, no, they're simply talking about a city. We move on, and it says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel serve with vigor, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they made them serve with vigor. Now, what we know from studying ancient Egyptian texts, the men primarily were responsible for building the bricks. They worked anywhere between 8 to 10 hours, and they had a lot of bricks each had to make, roughly 3,000 bricks. Okay, so in many places in the world today, they still make bricks this way. You go get water, you get mud, you make clay. They use straw to keep it found. You would use wood to make a frame. You'd pack it in there, and you pop it out, let the sun dry it, put it in a kiln, move on, right? So one of the pyramids that's kind of falling into bad repair, so as it's being fallen into bad repair, they can start doing archaeological assessment of the bricks themselves. They estimate that one of the pyramids had 24.1 million bricks to build it. Okay? And so when we read this section on their treatment of the Israelites, that their rigor and vigor, they beat them because they had to make them do more work, tire them out so they won't procreate as much as they are. That moves us into chapter 1, verse 15 through 22. I love these verses. I want to say right now, there is a literary approach to reading the text. It's called gapping, literary gapping. So if I were to just do a quick test with you, if you will all just work with me, close your eyes, and I want you to think of Pinocchio in the fish. Everybody understand? Okay. Open your eyes. All right. How many of you see him sitting upright with a candlestick? Y'all remember this little exercise? Now, if I were to tell you, and didn't tell you that, and I told you close your eyes and think of Jonah in the whale, you would many of you actually would pull this Pinocchio story into the Jonah account, because that's what our brains do. Literary gapping is that texts at times do not tell us everything that we need to know, but our brains fill them in. And the filling in sometimes actually distracts from what the text is saying. Okay? So those gaps are intentional. They're intentional for you to ask, why is the gap there? And what is the gap trying to communicate? Does everybody track? So we're going to answer those. The reason I bring that up is verses 15 through 22 is full of gaps. Not a problem. This is not a problem. This is actually intended for us to see and understand. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives. Also, possible translation, the king of Egypt said to the midwives of the Hebrews. Now that is two drastically different things that we're going to talk about in a moment. One of whose name was Shiphrah and the other Puah. This is a painting of them, allegedly. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. That's important because there's only one other person in our Bible who is said to have feared God before this moment. Does anyone know who that is? Abraham. When Abraham in chapter 17, here, the midwives fear God. We're going to come back to that. And did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Here's the first literary gap. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And said to them, why, and let the male children live. What is the literary gap? How in the world did he find out? Like we fill that gap in. I'm not saying the gap that we fill in is wrong, but that is an intentional gap that we fill in. They then say something wild in verse 19. The Hebrew text is even crazier, like in a explicit way. I'll keep your translations have done you a favor. The midwife said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are very vigorous and they give birth pretty quickly before we can get there. Now, there's a lot of questions we have at this point, and scholars have tried to figure it out. Number one, are Shiphrah and Puah Hebrews, or are they Egyptians? I really never thought of that until last semester. And one of my students wrote an entire seminar paper on Shiphrah and Puah more than likely are Egyptians. Because why would Hebrew women ever throw their children into the river? Now, one could push back and say, well, they didn't. That's the point. But why then do they make the distinction of the Hebrew women are different in childbirth than the Egyptian women? Because how would they know about the Egyptian women? Because there's no way they would let Hebrew slave women deliver Egyptian babies. I do think we have the answer to this question later as it relates to chapter 2. But that's irrelevant on that point until we get to it in a moment. I do have up here some interesting things about midwifery in the ancient Near East, and particularly there. The primary job was to cut the umbilical cord. In fact, the Hebrew text says they would sit on the birthing stool, but the way the text literally reads is that they sit on a stone with their hands to, quote, catch the baby. Like, that's what the text is like communicating. They're catching the baby, and so they cut the umbilical cord. If it's twins, they have to identify said twin, put a little rope around their wrist, and then they would rub the baby with salt, which I was assuming is an exfoliant to a lot. You're adults, you know, but it's also to get the baby clean, and then they swaddle the baby. Okay, so that's their roles. Now, when they do not do this, this is from Sarna's book. It says their defiance to the Pharaoh has been described as civil disobedience in defense of a moral clause. So if they're Egyptian, which is really powerful, it's showing a forecast of God of what he's going to do for his people. But also, if they are Egyptian, it introduces why Rahab and Ruth and Uriah, all these non-Israelites, are God's chosen children too. Now, notice I stopped and it said in verse 20. Also, there's a literary gap in verse 19. Apparently, that's all the Pharaoh needed to hear. They give birth too quick, and they also, scholars said 2 midwives can service 3,000 women. That on average, Hebrew women, if they're as big as the numbers they think, Hebrew women would give birth. There would be 7 to 8 births a day, and 2 women could do that. I'm like, that still sounds busy. Still sounds busy on my front. Okay. Verse 20. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, which is pushing you back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 27, 28, where to be fruitful and multiply, this genocide of infants to stave off their growth actually turns into their proliferation. And then the very beautiful verse 21. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them children. He gave them families. The executioner doesn't do the thing they were tasked to do, and they're given children as their own. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, which now makes it wonder, are the midwives Hebrew? It's hard to know. Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. All right, any questions? All right, I'm going to read the first verse of chapter 2, and then we're going to have another discussion. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and took to wife a daughter of Levi. So this moves us to Moses and his birth. You will notice up here it says, we are not told the name of Moses' parents or sister until later. We're told Moses' parents in chapter 6, verse 20, and Miriam in chapter 15, verse 20. Now, we'll be told Aaron sooner. Also, oddly, Moses is not mentioned and is not named until chapter 2, verse 10. The Pharaoh is not mentioned. Would have been a great time for Moses to say Tutmos III, Ramesses II. Those are your two options. Would have been awesome for him to do that. It would have been really helpful for us to say, I'm up here where you have his parents, Amram and Jochebed, Moses' parents. Been a great opportunity. What can you glean from that text that's so powerful? The only names that have been given so far are these two Hebrew midwives or Egyptian midwives. It also parallels the book of Joshua, where after the first chapter, sort of a summary of things happening, and Joshua says a few things, you have the two spies going to the land, and who does all the speaking in that narrative? Rahab. And then the Judahite male, par excellence of ancient Israel, is Achan in chapter 7, and he is killed the same way the Canaanites are in chapter 6. And yet, Rahab is spared. So the Shifra Pua has probably some connections with that kind of same narrative literary flow. Why Moses chooses to introduce this, I don't know. Hopefully we'll find out. So we know that Moses is a Levite. Right? So who is Levi? Y'all remember? He's one of the 12 sons. He's also quite famous for his quick response. We'll leave it there. Dinah, poor sweet Dinah, was violated pretty badly by a guy named Shechem. And Levi and Simeon go and convince them to do some cosmetic surgery, and then they just butcher them. You want to file that away for later, because when they make the golden calf, who comes in and does the purge? The Levites. So the Levites, its origin is Levi, and his origin is he defended the honor of his sister. They become known as the priestly tribe, and Aaron will be the high priest. Okay? Now, I know this is Exodus, but I'm a teacher at heart, and you have to learn this. Okay? So when David is king, David has a high priest. His name is Zadok. Everybody knows that. And when Saul's trying to kill him, okay, so he's not king yet, so we know he's going to get Zadok. Saul's trying to kill him. He flees to the town of Nob. Y'all are familiar? It's like 1 Samuel 20-ish. And he comes and he meets this guy named Abiathar. Abiathar is a priest in the city of Nob, a priestly city. And he says, Doeg the Edomite is over there and sees us, and Saul's going to try to kill us all. And he says, no, I'm going to take you with me. Well, when David becomes king, he makes Zadok high priest because he's Aaron's descendant, and he also makes Abiathar high priest. He has two high priests. Do y'all know that? And then when David is old and frail, 1 Kings 1, he can't get warm. They go get Abiashag. She comes and warms him up. His oldest son, rightful to the heir, Adonijah, is anointed king over Israel by none other than Abiathar. And then Nathan the prophet and Zadok the priest hear of it, and Benaiah, who hears of it, and they go to Bathsheba. She pitches a fit. They crown Solomon king. Y'all remember? And so now you have three kings. David tells him, kill them all. Solomon kills every one of them but one, Abiathar. He says, you must spend the rest of your life in Anatoth, 2 miles southeast or northeast of Jerusalem. Very obscure. And then you get Jeremiah chapter 1. It says, Jeremiah from the priestly family in Anatoth. Jeremiah is a descendant of Abiathar. And Ezekiel is a descendant of Zadok. And Zadok traces his history back to Aaron, and Abiathar traces his history back to, you guessed it, Moses. And when you get to the destruction of Jerusalem, they begin to fight over power in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now remember, who's going to be in control? Let me help you. Probably this is a hypothetical, but I'm pretty sure we're accurate here. Who's in control? Those who trace their line back to Aaron, or those who trace their line back to Moses? Now, I cannot prove this part, so do not hold this. That part we stand on pretty firm ground on. I do not hold this on firm ground. I often wonder in my mind if those two battling family traditions aren't the Pharisees and Sadducees. I often wonder if that dispute that was happening in the Second Temple Judaism period comes back to who was their great ancestor, Moses or Aaron. That little sidebar is important because the priesthood is going to have its own kind of pecking order as we work through it. I took time. All right. Then we see the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was, the text literally says, good with eyes, like looking with your eyes, attractive. I mean, he's no Saul. I mean, Saul's the most handsome man alive, but he's a cute baby. It's easy to look at. She hid him for 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she took him in a basket. So we ask ourselves, why 3 months? You all know this answer. I've had a bunch of foster kids in the house. I mean, we had little bitty babies one time, twins. We had to put in our bedroom. That's against the rule, by the way. But we had to put them in there because we could not hear them in the room. At 3 months, you're like, when do they turn into this bullhorn of lungs yelling? Which means at 3 months, she couldn't hide him anymore. And so this is powerful. The text does not translate correctly. I wish they would translate it correctly, but it doesn't. It's on the slide. She took him and she put him, in the text says, in an ark. It's the same word used in Genesis 6 through 9 for the ark of Noah. Not just the same word, even the description of made of bulrush and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch. Meaning, if you're reading the Hebrew text, you see that this little boy is being placed in an ark. It will be floated above the water, the same way Noah was built an ark of bitumen and pitch, who floated above the waters. God delivered his people through Noah in Genesis 6 through 9. And now this boy that is being abandoned, it will float upon the river, and he too will deliver his people. Now it says that she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds of the river's brink, and she stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And so up here on the next slide, it should say there's some things that we have to sort of unpack. Or I'm sorry, Zach, I don't have it on there. I probably deleted it for my own safety. So a couple of things. Why would she do this? That's the first question. And number two, what do we do with the information I'm about to tell you? All right, number one, the oldest civilization that we know that existed is the Sumerians. Y'all ever heard of the Sumerians? And their first king was Sargon the Great. Y'all are familiar with Sargon the Great? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. So they lived around allegedly 3000 BC. So Sargon the Great, there's a very famous text about Sargon the Great. It actually is after Moses. Does everybody understand? After Moses. That he was born of a priestess, and his father abandoned him. And when she could no longer care for him, she put him in a basket, floated him down a river, and Aki, drawer of water, that's his name, drew him out of the water, taught him to grow up to be a farmer, and then the god Ishtar loved him, and he became king 55 years in ancient Samaria. Now, there are lots of points of contact, by the way. And I'm not telling you this to confuse you. I'm gonna tie the bow up for us, I promise. Do you want to know how many accounts of those abandoned hero motifs are found in antiquity? over 25. And they span almost every continent of the world. I would even argue that the content driving the movie Tarzan is built on that same notion. Does everybody understand? Now, why would I bring that up? Two things. Number one, it is a fact Sargon the Great was older than Moses. It's fact. Number two, if the tradition is that Sargon the Great was placed in a basket, flowed down a river, oral tradition, that maybe, hypothetically, maybe she's aware of that. And she puts her baby in the basket in hopes that someone would rescue him. Number two, putting him in the basket, floating him down river also does something else. I don't have to see the child die. It's the same thing that Hagar does with Ishmael. Do you remember? She put him away from her under a tree so that, quote, she would not know what happened to the boy. And the Spirit of the Lord comes to her and says, what are you doing? Go get him. Go give him some food. Now, as crazy as that sounds, the other option is that because the Sargon the Great story is written after, it's 9th century BC, that those are copies of this text. That's possible. But I want to give you an illustration, and I think it lands well here. I grew up in Winfield, Louisiana, and I always heard a guy killed a deer by jumping out of the deer stand with a knife. Okay? I'm a little too old for that these days. But I used to deer hunt with a big knife on my hip, hoping for that moment to arise. Now, Terry's a hunter. Terry, did you ever hear this? Okay. I asked a class that one time, and a young man from California, I didn't even know they deer hunted in California. I digress. He said, oh yeah, I heard that growing up as a child too. So there was people all across the South, a guy in California, we've all heard the urban legend of someone jumping out of a deer stand, killing a deer with a knife. But someone had to have done it to start the urban legend. And in fact, now that we have all the social media accounts, we have people in it truly trying to do it. Now, as silly as that account is, I have to believe that all these stories in antiquity either are drawing from the same source, it could be this text, or the Sargon text. But the reality is, if it is the Sargon text, in the back of my mind, if I'm an endangered mother whose child has just been brought to this earth, and the edict of killing all little boys, she's heard this fictitious narrative of Sargon the Great, and she places him in a basket, hoping that there would be some kind of sovereignty to deliver him. More than likely, the Sargon the Great texts are ripping off the Exodus account. Does everybody understand? And that they're proliferating themselves in other cultures. I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm just letting you know, if you go grab a book, they're going to talk about these small things. But I do think that more importantly to me, is the ark in the basket. That's powerful, theologically speaking. Verse 5 says, now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket in the reeds. Technically, the text says stuck in the reeds on the right side of the river, but and she sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. So clearly there is a distinctive difference between what an Egyptian looks like and a Hebrew looks like. Does everybody understand? But I don't have time. I don't have time to talk about that, but you can figure that out. And then I have to tell my college kids this, because they don't always connect the dots. Then the Miriam, it doesn't say Miriam, but the sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, like, where does she come from? Like, I know she was afar, but she just kind of sauntered over and be like, hey, what are y'all doing? What's in the box? Like what? Pharaoh said to her, she said, should I go and call the child's mother? Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I'll give you his wages. So she goes and gets the mother. Still not named. Breastfeeds the baby, Typically in antiquity, they would breastfeed for 3 to 4 years until the child can function on his own. And so we collapsed that down, but she raised that child a while and returns the child to the Pharaoh's daughter, which, by the way, after break, if she recognizes him as being Hebrew, that means her dad had to recognize that he was Hebrew. Okay? I've got 2 minutes, so I will introduce this. We can chew on it over our snack and come back. This is going to hurt your heads. This is why I think the Hebrew midwives should be midwives of the Hebrews. I think they could be both Egyptian or Hebrew. And this is quite clever of Moses, but I also think it'll help when we get back from the break. As the child grew, verse 10, she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him. That's vague. Who named who? It seems like the Pharaoh's daughter named him. Okay, does everybody understand? Okay. Now, this is the only, I'm trusting someone else on this because I didn't go to do all the research on it. According to one scholar, this is the only place in the entire Bible where a child is born and not immediately named. Whether she breastfed him for a year or for 3 years, he was nameless for a period. And then the text gets really strange. The Pharaoh's daughter, if that's who she named him, Moses, for she said, because I drew him out of the water, which is what she did. So that is her speaking. Now the irony is, Moses' name in Hebrew is Moshe, and the verb draw out of is Mashe. Moshe, Mashe. Why is a Egyptian woman speaking a wordplay in Hebrew? Does everybody understand? All right. Can I go 5 minutes or take a break? Okay. All right, so next slide then. This is going to make your heads hurt. Full disclosure. All right, so the etymology, that's just a big fancy word for the origin of a word. For the name Moses is from the Egyptian word to bear or to give birth to, if it's Egyptian. Does everybody track? So the Egyptian mom, the adoptive mom, says Moshe, which in Egyptian means to give birth to, but then she includes the verb mashe, which is the Hebrew word to draw out. So the etymology of the name Moshe in Egyptian means to give birth to or to bear. This name follows the popular formulas of the New Kingdom. Thus, Moses means in Egyptian to bear, give birth to, which means the name Moses is part of a theophoric name. Theophoric means a divinity or a divine God plus Moses. Does everybody understand? I've put them up here. All of you are familiar with the names up here. Not Yahweh. That's me messing with you. Amos, Patamos, Tutmos, Amimos. Ramesses is also Ramos, which means that every one of those pharaohs in the New Kingdom's name was what? I am the child or the son of the god Ra, Ptah, Ammon, Tut. Same thing we have when David fights Ben-Hadad the first and the second. Son of the god Hadad. Son of the god Hadad too. Y'all tracking along? That is a normal pattern. Now I have up on the screen son of Yahweh. And that's where we're going to come back after the break. But when Moses in chapter 3 asks, what is your name? God does not answer him clearly. He answers him cryptically. Because I think Moses, and I'm not alone in this, I came to this my own conclusion, and then I read something, and this guy was smarter than me. I was like, I knew I was right. I could be wrong. But when Moses says, what am I supposed to tell me your name is? And God then says, I am who I am. God, and remember, he is an Egyptian boy by this time. He is raised Egyptian. He is familiar with who all these pharaohs are, what their names are, Moses plus a deity's name. He fully expects to go back to Israel the people of Israel in Egypt and say, my name is Yahweh Moses, and I'm here to deliver you. And God says, no, you're not. No, you're not. We're going to cover that in chapter 3. So that's really powerful. But this text is Hebrew. And so it's almost a play on words. You have an Egyptian mom speaking Hebrew words. You have vagueness of who are Shiphrah and Puah saving Hebrew boys. And it does appear then that these two texts have some strange interplay of the vagueness of what does Moses' name really mean, and are Shiphrah and Puah Egyptian or Hebrew? And we're going to get clarity in chapter 3. Time for a break. Sound good?